Welcome, and thanks for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast today. If you like what you hear, we'd encourage you to please leave us a rating and a review on iTunes or wherever you're listening to this. This really helps other folks find out about the podcast, our great guests, and the wisdom that they have to share. So without further ado, on to today's episode.
Please listen carefully.
Welcome to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. My name is Brad Stevens, and I'll be your host today. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to our guest, Mr. Eric Jaffe, who's the Editorial Director at Sidewalk Labs. How are you doing today, Eric?
I'm great, Brad. Thank you very much.
Well, very good. It's as someone who's in this field, I know what Sidewalk Labs is, but can you tell us a little bit about what that is and what you're up to these days?
Sure, of course. So Sidewalk Labs is an alphabet company that was formed a couple years ago by Dan Doctoroff, the former deputy mayor of New York City, and by Larry Page, obviously the co-founder of Google. And the idea was, can we take the best that we've learned about urban policy, urban design, community planning from New York City during the Bloomberg years, and can we combine that with the best that Google knows how to do in terms of new digital tools and open digital infrastructure? And can we do those things? Can we put them together in an effort to address some of the biggest challenges facing big urban environments today, whether that's transportation, mobility, equity, housing costs, housing affordability, obviously energy use and building sustainability? Can we kind of marry these two different worlds in the service of improving quality of life in cities?
And so how did you kind of wind up doing this?
Yeah, so I had been a journalist for many years, most recently with The Atlantic, working at CityLab, which was The Atlantic's urban life channel. I'd been a contributor since the launch and foundation of CityLab, and had most recently been up here as the New York City bureau chief. And these are the conversations we've been having every day at CityLab. And frankly, the reason that channel was created is because urban systems, urban development, urban life more broadly has become front and center in the kind of American discourse, in good ways and bad. And we're starting to appreciate just the value that cities bring, socially, culturally, economically to the world. And then also with that, of course, the unique challenges that each particular city will face when you get a whole bunch of people with a whole different bunch of ideas, a whole different bunch of priorities together in one closely confined place. And so for me, this was kind of the natural next step in terms of you've been a journalist talking about what cities are doing well, what they're not doing well, where they should get better. Maybe now it's time to think about actually implementing some of those ideas and seeing how they work in the real world. And it's not easy.
Oh, the good work seldom is, I suppose. I wonder, could you take us back to when you kind of first got interested in these things? I think your background, if I'm not mistaken, a long time ago was just journalism. Was there something about cities that was particularly compelling to you?
So I ended up getting into cities through transportation, and it was more specifically through my first book, which was called The King's Best Highway, which is a social history of American transportation, really going back to colonial days, using the first highway in the U.S. called the Boston Post Road as kind of the character, if you will, the narrative thread to tie us from colonial days to the present day, and looking at how this one road and the transportation evolutions that occurred on top of it kind of really reflect the ways we have changed as a nation and as a people. And so that was my kind of ridiculously ambitious effort at writing a first book when I was in my mid-20s and had just moved up to New York and learned about this road, the Boston Road, which still exists in many parts of New York, at some parts of New York at least, and in many stretches between New York and Boston, which is where that first highway, that first U.S. official postal road is its real claim to fame. That's where it's located. And so, when you start to study the history of American transportation, and eventually you work your way up into the 20th century and the kind of rise of the automobile and the takeover of highways and how they've kind of gone through cities and changed cities, in so many ways negatively. And it's not all negative. I think I probably come off as someone, at least in my writing at City Lab, as someone who's fully opposed to cars, fully opposed to highways. I don't feel that way 100%. There were some tremendous improvements to life that were achieved by the creation of a coast-to-coast infrastructure like the highway system we have. Obviously, we overbuilt it. Obviously, it should not have torn through cities and existing communities. And obviously, we now have a mess on our hands in terms of maintaining that infrastructure. But when you start to kind of look at it through that historical lens and you get up to the modern day and you recognize, okay, roads, the way we thought of them a century ago, roads and cars, they're not going to work for cities today. They can't work for cities today. So even if we didn't know the future back then and plan in the precisely correct way of how to grow, what can we do today to change that and to start to rebalance our transportation system? So that's really how I got into this.
Do you think in kind of the same way that you can write, a history of this country through the history of our roads, that in the future people will look back at cities and that'll be one of the best tools for understanding how our society is moving at this point?
Yeah, I think you really can look at cities as the heartbeat of certainly of a country, but of innovation as well, as something I've come to start to see it as. We have a series that we've recently put out here at Sidewalk Labs on our blog of a history of innovations that kind of define the modern city, and it's things obviously like the elevator, and obviously like the traction motor that powered our subways, pretty obvious things, but also kind of innovations like zoning and things like disease mapping that might not kind of immediately come to mind, but that really reflect at the end of the day the challenges that you can only find in cities. It is the challenges of putting so many people together in one place, and they differ dramatically from the other types of challenges that historically we've found on this planet. And we do it because the benefits of cities are so great. The ability of an urban environment to kind of help lift people out of poverty and into the middle class and into new opportunities is tremendous and like nothing else we have. And the impacts economically of agglomeration economies in terms of being able to share that wealth and spread those resources and use kind of shared assets to spread the costs across a whole population. There's nothing like it in terms of the benefits when we get it right. So I do think you're right. We could look at cities as kind of this lens that shows us when we're operating and functioning well as social beings and when we're not.
Well, I'm intrigued because I've been fascinated to follow this 15 innovations thing that you guys have put out, and I'm particularly interested, like looking forward. I know you guys are about to launch a huge project in Toronto, but I'm wondering how you marry that difference between the digital and the technical side of innovation and the more civic-minded stuff, that zoning side of things, the government innovation, the way that we think about how those systems are. Is there one of those that is more difficult than the other? How do you kind of marry those two together in this struggle?
Yeah, that's a great question, Brad. I think so I think about innovation as being much more than technology, and sometimes as a company that's kind of an alphabet company with relationships to Google, we get lumped into this technology bucket. But really the folks that work here and me personally, we see innovation as, sure, it includes technology. It also includes design. It also includes systems infrastructure, and it also includes policy. Those are kind of all areas of innovation that need to be operating in tandem, in concert, in order to have even greater impact. But to use your example of zoning, so let's take that example. I mean, obviously we want to move more toward a mixed-use type of zoning atmosphere, right? We understand that when you put shops and offices and houses all within the same kind of area, the same neighborhood, you get walkability, you get lively streetscapes, you get kind of all the things we have come to know and love about human scale development, you get transit that works well, and you get so many great local economic benefits in terms of jobs and in terms of businesses that are able to start. And so how do you do that? Well, the first thing you have to do is obviously as a government, as a city, you have to recognize the need for that policy. Okay, so we go away from single-use zoning and we try to encourage more mixed-use zoning. But what role does data play in that? What role can technology or innovation play? Well, in our particular case, we think there is a big role for data in terms of enabling the types of, performance-based zoning that folks like Jane Jacobs have been talking about for decades. These are what enables a mixed-use community is the ability for a structure to take any number of uses. And in order to do that safely, you have to make sure that the essence of single-use zoning, the safety, the ability of the public not to be kind of interfered with in their day-to-day lives are preserved, right? So you want structural integrity to be preserved. You want noise pollution to be preserved. You want certainly air quality to be preserved. These are the types of things that if you trace it back far enough, single-use zoning was trying to protect. We think if you set those thresholds at the city level, data provides a way to monitor in real time whether a building structure is meeting them. And so you don't have to a priori restrict a development, a neighborhood for being just a specific type of usage, just houses, just manufacturing. You can say, you can be whatever you want as long as you live within these rules. And you know what? We can measure these rules in real time because we know exactly what your building's doing and how loud you're being and how many emissions you're putting off into the air and whether or not you're damaging the structure of the building. And those types of things, I think, we see as it's a way to enhance what cities already know is the right policy, right? Mixed use. We already know that's what we need more of in the future. This is a way that we can help do that in a safe way and give cities and local businesses and local offices and residences the chance to define themselves.
I'm intrigued that it's obvious from listening to you that there's complexity and understanding that complexity is huge for what you guys are looking to do. I'm also hearing a lot about the government and policy and those side of things. I'm wondering kind of how you marry those two and what you guys kind of view as that role of government when traditionally government hasn't been as quick to respond to these kind of things and as flexible as kind of some of the stuff you're mentioning.
Yeah, it can be tough sometimes. I mean, so government has its reasons for moving more slowly as well. Obviously, it needs to preserve the public interest. It needs to preserve public safety, and so there are good reasons to move slow if you're in government sometimes. And so it's nice to kind of the flip side of that is that technology can sometimes offer an excuse to relitigate some of these conversations, these policy conversations that maybe we haven't talked about before. So let's think of something like, I'm thinking of congestion pricing here in New York. That was something that, as part of the Bloomberg administration, a lot of folks now work on the sidewalk team. They were kind of essential supporters of let's charge cars during the peak hours that are entering the central core of Manhattan. Let's use that money to be reinvested across the city in transit projects so that the alternatives, if you can't drive into the city, if you don't want to drive into the city, are improved and they're better, and that there's a secure, stable funding mechanism for transit moving forward. And so obviously that's That's the type of government innovation that we see in a few cities around the world, not many, but a few, but that we weren't able to bring here in New York. It ultimately was defeated, but that you see once again kind of popping up in the public discourse. You know what? It's been 10 years, and we're starting to see op-eds in the New York-based papers saying, you know what? Let's revisit congestion pricing. And you know why? Because our subways are falling apart, and we have no money to pay for all this stuff that we all agree is a priority in terms of alternative transportation options. And so, what I see often as in some ways the role of technology is an opportunity to kind of open these cases again. So you see, self-driving vehicles emerging, and you kind of think about the obvious need to then revisit a pricing structure in cities so that, as has been pointed out by Robin Chase and others, we don't have zombie cars driving around the roads and clogging them up and making traffic much worse. and so what you get is kind of, even if technology doesn't offer a clear, obvious solution, there rarely are those in cities, you get the opportunity to kind of step back and say, you know what, we're a government, let's consider this again. Let's think about pricing and curbs, and let's think about the policies we could implement, knowing that this new technology is on the horizon and that this stuff's coming whether we like it or not. And one of my colleagues, Rit Agarwal, he refers to this sometimes as kind of the polar bear problem. We all knew the climate was changing, but it was until we saw the pictures of the polar bears sitting there on the icebergs that were just kind of floating away. That's when a lot of people, at least, really started kicking up and getting into action. And it can be similar sometimes with technology in terms of, we don't know exactly what role some of these tools will play in addressing the challenges facing cities, and some of it will involve policy. So let's use this opportunity to revisit all of that.
That's fascinating. There's so much to dig into there. I'm wondering about, there's many cities that are now wondering about this driverless car, this automated vehicle question. And part of what excites me so much about what you guys do is that you have the capacity and to think way into the future. And I'm wondering kind of how you encourage other folks to have that conversation. So to move from having this conversation about we need to find a way to fund our public transit to, hey, in 20 years, there's going to be a whole nother issue and we need to be thinking about that now. How do you begin to have those conversations?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And part of what you do, I think at least, is someone who's always kind of gone to history first, is you look at the history and you say, as you look back to the early 20th century, well, what did we do with cars? Cars entered cities, and the classic narrative, of course, is they took over and it was that simple and they ruled the day. And maybe that would have happened, but when you kind of take the richer look, some of it captured kind of most wonderfully in Peter Norton's book, Fighting Traffic, what you find at the end of the day is that policy played an enormous role. In fact, probably the biggest role in terms of how cars were able to monopolize city streets, how we were able to kind of create this notion of a jaywalker when in fact people had always ruled the streets and now they're criminals if they cross the street wherever they want. And so the ways that policy kind of had an impact on the evolution of technology, it's one of the key lessons when you look back. And so when we're thinking about self-driving vehicles, it's the same thing. We don't know exactly what our cities will look like when these vehicles will start to emerge. We can't, because we don't know how people will use the technology exactly. But we know, if you study the history closely, that policy will have an enormous impact on eventually how they're used and how they're adopted and what types of, hopefully, benefits they can provide to a city. So you take that chance I was talking about before to revisit everything you think has been set in stone. Can we think about street width differently? Can we think about street classification differently? Do we need arterials? Can we start to separate fast-moving traffic from slow-moving traffic? Can we, getting back to pricing, can we charge your car more if it's going to go onto what we consider a pedestrian street? Can we ban it from that street? Can we eliminate street parking entirely because these are fleets of self-driving vehicles? Some of them are vans, some are buses, some might be private cars, or rather individual cars. And can we say those are all going to park on the outskirts of the city anyway? We don't need that whole 10 feet of curb space on either side. Let's move the buildings up and make them bigger, or let's move the buildings to one side of the street and make a park on the other side. All of the kind of cascading impacts that you can start to see once you just remove that initial hierarchy that exists today in terms of a street has to look like this because cars need this much space and because parking needs this much space. You can start to kind of really dive into the exciting opportunities with what a city can look like. And that's what we try to do here at Sidewalk, knowing, there are no certain answers to the ways these technologies will evolve. You can't know how people will end up using them at the end of the day. What you do know is that the rules that are put in place by the cities, by planners, by the ways we organize our spaces are going to have a huge impact, if not the biggest impact, on how ultimately these things are adopted.
We'd like to take a moment now to say thank you to our sponsors today. The Urban Affairs and Planning program at Virginia Tech School of Public and International Affairs offers an interdisciplinary approach to understanding planning and policy for mega regions, cities, suburbs, and rural regions in the U.S. and abroad. UAP faculty have expertise in urban planning, architecture, urban design, economics, geography, political science, law, technology, and engineering, and provide students with a multifaceted understanding of how communities grow and change. Students apply their knowledge and professional skills by participating in real-world problem-solving with community clients through project-based studios and applied research. UAP emphasizes technical analysis and policy evaluation in approaching the complexities of modern communities. So big thanks today to the Urban Affairs and Planning program down at Virginia Tech for being our sponsor. If you'd like to hear more, check them out online. But without further ado, we'll get back to today's guest. Thank you. Well, I'm intrigued listening to kind of the solutions that you think may be out there that they, these are things that we haven't typically thought of before. And I'm wondering then how you, within your organization, I think it's probably fairly easy to get people to be thinking about, these are things that would change the way we do things, and let's just open up any box that's available. How do you get kind of people that are on the policy side or even the general public to understand and move from a place of, we can't do that. There's no way we can charge people for that. That's not either politically feasible or technologically feasible. How do you kind of move beyond that into a space of thinking more openly about possibilities?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. You're not going to move everybody. The way we've tried to go about that is by actually taking that step back and thinking about how all these things might work together and putting together what we feel like is a compelling enough vision to kind of make people second guess the long-standing kind of convictions and conventional wisdoms that they've accepted in terms of how a city should look and what it needs to be and how it needs to operate. And so, at Sidewalk, before we launched this new project with Toronto, which I can explain a bit more about in a moment, we took about a year to just kind of step back and we gathered experts from all areas, whether it was transportation, housing, government services in some cases, in terms of how we deliver the right healthcare, the right education. And we said, what if we can start from scratch? Usually we can't in cities, but let's do this thought exercise and say, what if we can start with scratch, knowing the trends that are emerging in terms of innovation, both on the technology side and on the design side, knowing what we think are the policies that would move in the right direction, stuff like performance-based zoning, stuff potentially like road pricing, that could start to shape and refine the way these technologies emerge. And what if we put them all together? What could we get? And so what we found when we did this study over the course of a year with so many experts kind of weighing in terms of the types of things that were possible is we found tremendous potential quality of life benefits just kind of sitting on the table. So we thought that there's actually a realistic substantive case for reducing cost of living in a neighborhood built near a tier 1 city by 14% for a family of 4. And you get those cost reductions a couple ways. You get them through transportation costs. Your family no longer has to own a car in order to get around. The mobility options are so ubiquitous and vast that the cost of transporting people goes down, in part because the cars are autonomous. And you get some of it that way. You get some of the savings through housing. We think that using more modular, automated construction techniques, we can reduce the cost of buildings some 30% or so. Now, obviously, housing is market driven, and it's not all about the cost of what the structure itself ends up being. But that's at least part of it, and able to move the needle, all things kept equal. And so when you put those things together and you add in some savings you get in terms of utilities, we think the costs can go down 14% for a family of 4, based on some of our thought experiments that we're using kind of actual city urban environments as the standard in case, like the as the reference point for the savings. And so you get that kind of savings. You get an hour back a day saved through commuting by things not just like a fleet of self-driving vehicles, but the fact that we are creating or enabling mixed-use neighborhoods where you can walk to work. That reduces the need to commute as much as we think about commuting today. And so you get that space back. The parking space that gets saved that I mentioned earlier. We think you can expand the open space of a neighborhood by I don't know if I have the exact percentage in my head, but basically make it possible for open public space to be available within 5 minutes of every residence. Right now, I think some cities like New York aim for 10 minutes, and that's great, and they do a good job, but we can have that. And many cities aren't even that good. And so you start to see these quality of life benefits stacking up. And, I don't know if we can accomplish all of them. Again, this is an exercise that was done on paper. We know that real life is tricky and difficult and different. But our thesis here is that if you're at least receptive to the possibility of these combined innovations having an impact, and if you listen to the types of benefits we think can be achieved, and if you put all that together, isn't it worth having the conversation about creating this type of place and revisiting, again, to your actual question, revisiting some of these cases and these policy discussions that we've considered closed for so long? I mean, if that's not going to open your mind back up, if you're a politician, if you're a civil servant, and the prospect of, a more affordable, convenient, green, and we hope even equitable neighborhood doesn't move the needle for you, you're in the wrong business. And so we think that case is powerful. It's the type of case we made with Toronto. For reference there, they issued an RFP, not the city actually, but an entity called Waterfront Toronto, which is a tri-government agency that operates under close watch of Toronto's 10-mile waterfront near downtown. They issued an RFP earlier this year. We responded to that RFP with our vision of a place that kind of combines technology and urban ideas in the way I've been talking about. And we were selected during that competitive process to be the partner for Waterfront Toronto. Very, very excited, really thrilled to be working with such a great agency in what is truly, I'm learning as I visit it now, such an extraordinary city in terms of how open the people are, how thoughtful they are about the urban discourse. You wouldn't believe it. It's like I'm reading the City Lab comment section whenever I go to have a public conversation. And the openness of government to innovation and trying new ideas, again, to your point, is actually quite high, or at least on paper, it's quite high. And just kind of, at the same time, the challenges that they're facing in terms of becoming a truly global city with affordability issues, with transportation, commuting, traffic issues, with a very keen conviction of being one of the greenest places in the world. So you've got all these challenges that exist as well there. And we're really excited. We announced the partnership in October. We are going to take this first year to really develop a plan with the community. We hope it's in very close partnership, not just with our partner, Waterfront Toronto, the agency, but also the city itself and really the local community. We had our first town hall earlier this month. We're going to have a whole calendar of public engagement efforts so that we can hear about the ideas the community has, the priorities the community has, the values the community has. We released our vision for this place, what ended up being a 200-page or so document that I had a great hand in, along with all of our team members here in creating. We released that online so that people could react to it, respond to it, tell us what excites them, tell us what concerns them. And we're really hoping to kind of change the conversation from what I regard as a rather stale smart cities conversation in terms of, what data can do to really a more fulsome, robust conversation about how we want priorities and benefits for people to drive what choices are made when it comes to technology and data.
Well, I'm intrigued as I'm listening to you say all this. It's really exciting, and I'm wondering from your guys' perspective, you have to know that some of what you're going to do is probably going to be very successful and other things are probably going to fail. But I'm wondering, how do you guys define success in some ways in this endeavor?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think the first metric of success is, do we move the needle on quality of life in the ways I mentioned? Is housing more affordable relative to, maybe a controlled neighborhood with similar circumstances in this place? Is it more convenient to move around this place, either because biking and walking is so easy, or because homes and shops and works are so close together, or because a mobility as a service type system with shared, driverless vans or buses is actually that effective. That's kind of job one. If we fail on that, if we can't make a place where quality of life gets better and not just for elites, but I would point out for everyone. We want this to be an inclusive community that reflects the broad demographics, the broad diversity of a place like Toronto. If we can't meet that threshold, then why are we doing this? We won't be doing this. So that's kind of job one. But beyond that, we kind of see this as a way to explore the types of initiatives that could be transferred to other cities. We hope around the world, to other neighborhoods in Toronto, first of all, but we hope ultimately around the world, if cities, are able to look at what we're doing there and say that's working and actually it's feasible where we are. Let's try to adopt that. Let's work with this place, with Sidewalk Toronto, and learn how they did it and what it would take for us to do it. That would be, that's when we would really start to have an impact on cities writ large, the global urban conversation. And that, I think, is a secondary, but really kind of 1A or 1B goal in terms of what we hope to achieve there. Replicability, transferability of some of these ideas to help cities across the world.
With someone like yourself whose background is journalism and communications in some way, I'm wondering kind of how you guys plan to disseminate some of the information that comes out of this.
I'm open to ideas if you have good ones. that's definitely something I'm actively working on, thinking about. I think we have made it a goal to be incredibly transparent through this process, and we hope to and believe we will be able to kind of live up to that goal. It started with releasing our RFP vision, which is not actually something that was traditionally done in cases in requests for proposals that were solicited by this agency, but we want to get off on the right foot, and we want to say, here's our ideas. And then ultimately, as the public conversation, the public discourse shapes and refines the ideas, to your point, we need to come back and say, all right, here's how things have changed. Here's how we've learned. Here's how these ideas are better now. Here's how these ideas, 3, 4, 5, don't work anymore. And here's these ideas 4, 5, 6 that we hadn't even thought of, that actually let's get those into the plan, because they're going to make a lot of sense. So I think, we expect and anticipate and look forward to that conversation and that back and forth, and figuring out how to kind of show what we've learned and show the latest of what we're thinking. That's going to occupy a lot of my time in the coming months. But I can assure you, everything that we can possibly put up online at the site sidewalktoronto.ca, through our other channels at Sidewalk Labs, be it social media or our Medium blog or our website itself or our newsletter, which I encourage everyone to sign up for. We'll be trying to do that so that, to your point, we can't have any hope of impacting the way other cities operate and inspiring other cities, I should say, to look at some of our ideas if we're not vocal about what those ideas are.
Well, I'm intrigued as well that you guys are part of a much larger team, but also that a corporation like this, you guys have some incredible talent and part of your pool. And I'm trying to find a way to say this that's nice, but essentially, humility can often be hard to find in super talented organizations. And I'm wondering kind of how you guys are intentionally ensuring that you guys make listening a large part of your endeavor here at the beginning.
I think you're exactly right, and humility and listening is going to be key. And how we make sure we're going to do it is we've decided to prioritize it, first of all, but also we're going to lean on our partner, Waterfront Toronto, who knows the community better than we do, who knows the city better than we do, who knows which stakeholders, which population groups need to be heard, which haven't been heard and need to be heard, which have important things to say and important issues to raise. And so I think, we really view this as a partnership. There's a reason we took the two names of Waterfront Toronto and Sidewalk Labs and made them Sidewalk Toronto. This is 50-50 in terms of how we're going into this, and there are some things we bring to the table that I think are probably we're better suited to lead, and there are some things they bring to the table that they're certainly better suited to lead. And understanding the public sentiment, understanding the tone of how Torontonians operate, and understanding how to listen, to your point, is exactly what we are looking for them to lead on, and we're excited that they've already started that.
It feels like so much we could talk about there, but
I'm happy to come back.
Well, I wonder as we kind of get towards the end of our time, if you could share, you've been working with this through City Lab and now Sidewalk Labs for a while now, and I wonder if there's something that you've kind of learned along the way that has surprised you, or something that you didn't kind of think you'd be thinking at this point.
Thing that surprised me, or that I didn't think I'd been thinking. The thing I always go back to, and I wrote it, I think, in the introduction to this series on innovations, is that it really does take time to change cities. Even with a great idea, and even with all the reason in the world, I think it takes a long time. And we need to remember that as people who, half of our company has technology in their DNA, and they don't kind of understand why things can't change tomorrow and start over. It comes down to the urbanists among us, the urbanists in this company, saying, you know what, actually slow down. There are other things you need to consider that you haven't considered. And it's kind of the hybrid of those two perspectives and those two approaches that I think is really something our CEO, Dan Doctoroff, the former deputy mayor, has tried to instill in this company from the start. And it's a lesson that's really well taken when you dive back into the history. You look at it, something even as transformative as the electric traction motor, and you're thinking, all right, why can't everything tomorrow be powered by electricity? Why can't the elevators and the trains and everything just be using this new incredible technology? And yet it took basically a whole generation for the changes to occur, and it's because everything else about life had to change before electricity could really have its impact. We had to kind of change the entire grid of what our utility infrastructure was, and you think about the kind of cascading secondary changes that needed to occur so that this one core technology could have its impact. I think it's a great reminder that digital tools can help if they're used in the right way, if they're applied to the right problem, but they're not going to be an instant solution. They're not going to be a quick fix. And a lot of these problems are tough because they're tough, not because we haven't thought of the right solution yet. And so a lot of these changes we've talked about and these benefits we think can occur, I think we understand when we really step back, it's going to take a long time. We hope not as long as it took, to get to this point, but understanding that there is no overnight change, or we already would have found it.
That really speaks to kind of your background and some of the history stuff. It's a powerful way to think of it. But I wonder if you could wrap us up with a story that you think kind of encapsulates what happens when cities work well, or when communities are acting in the way that they should.
Sure. The one story I want to tell, as you raised this earlier, comes to mind is when I'm doing this series. The one that really stuck out to me is the story of GTFS, the General Transit Feed Specification. Basically, the data that tells you where the trains are, where the buses are, where the transit vehicles are at any point in time. And I think it's kind of for me at least, it's a great representation of what a city that embraces technology, that embraces digital innovation, how we can benefit from that. And so what you had was you had somebody from the Portland Transit Authority, TriMet, and she was kind of traveling and not understanding, this is years ago, in the early 2000s, I believe, I can check on the date, but wondering why she didn't know what time the train was going to arrive. Like you had to check kind of the posted bulletin board, on paper, and it's kind of ridiculous. We're at the cusp of everybody having smartphones, and it's unclear when the next subway or the next light rail or the next bus is going to arrive. And so she teamed up with somebody at Google, and what they did together was kind of standardize all the transit data for TriMet, for Portland, so that anybody who wants to develop a tool to tell you when the next bus is going to arrive, to tell you when the next train is going to arrive, could do so using this data. The data was now in a standard format. It was easy for any developer to use. It was easy for any city agency to use. And by kind of putting those two things together, it seems so simple now, but think about what you open up. You open up a person's day. They can now kind of rely on the fact that they can check a schedule on demand before they leave. They can be psychologically reassured when they're standing on the platform that they're not just waiting and praying and hoping some train's going to come. They know when it's going to come. They know how much time they have. They know if they should make alternative plans. And going beyond that, it really is an example of how open digital infrastructure can unleash an entire world of options in terms of, let's plug bike share into the same feed, and let's plug all your transit options into this feed, and let's plug that fleet of self-driving vehicles into this feed. And now you know every single one of your options at every single moment, and exactly how it's going to cost, and exactly how long it's going to take to get there and to get you where you need to go. And you think about it starting as an idea somebody had as an agency teaming up with a technology company. That is what I imagine this place that we're creating, or we're starting to plan in Toronto can and should feel like and operate like, in terms of knowing what options we have, what data we have, and putting that in the service of people who just want to get around, people who have a place to go, and making it easier for them. That, I think, to me, is kind of the one of the great lessons I've found in terms of how we can partner in smart ways as public and private entities, and how we can use what's already out there in terms of data and actually put it to work and create a template for others to work with.
That's a powerful vision to leave us with there. And I wonder, as we wrap up here, Eric, if there people are interested in what you have to say, where can they find out more information about what you guys are up to?
Sure. So you can, of course, visit sidewalklabs.com. As I mentioned, the Sidewalk Toronto project page is sidewalktoronto.ca. You can visit us at social media at Sidewalk Labs on Twitter. Also, if you are interested, we have a weekly newsletter that Sidewalk Labs puts out that I'm very proud to say I'm the author of with some of my colleagues here in the editorial team, that you can sign up for at the bottom of the Sidewalk Labs page. And we try to give updates on what we're doing, updates on the kinds of things we're thinking about, many of which have been explored here today with you, Brad, and then updates on kind of what we're reading as well in terms of the world of urban technology.
Well, wonderful. And for those of you all that are interested in CityWorks Expo, you can find out more about us at cityworksxpo.com. And we'd love to have you back, Eric, and to hear more about this when you guys are a little further along. But thank you so much for taking the time.
Anytime, Brad.
Thank you for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast today. If you like what you hear, please subscribe and leave a rating. It really helps other people find out about our fascinating guests and find the information that we have to share. Lastly, please save the day for our upcoming event, October 5th through 7th in Roanoke, Virginia. And keep up to date by following us on Facebook and checking out our website, cityworksexpo.com. That's cityworksxpo.com. Thank you guys again, and look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.